So, after talking about the introductory stuff and research methods used by social psychologists, let's move into some more substantive topics. And the first I want to talk about is socialization. Humans are social beings. We all live in a society. We consume society's products. We interact with other people in our everyday lives. And we live, work, and play within the various social institutions, such as families, schools, and corporations, that make up a society. A prerequisite for living in any society is to be a competent member of society, which means becoming someone who has the required knowledge and skills necessary to live and survive in a particular society. However, no one is born a competent member of a society. That is, no one is born with the knowledge and skills they'll need to get by in a society. Newborn babies aren't born with the knowledge of a language in which people in a society communicate with one another. They are not born with the knowledge of morals and ethics that guide behavior in a particular society. They are not even born with any conception about who they are. To become competent members of society, people have to go through the process of socialization, or the process whereby new members of social groups are taught how to become competent members of these social groups. Cases of extreme child abuse teach the importance of socialization and making people competent members of society. For example, consider Jeannie, a terribly abused and neglected little girl who was born in the 1970s. Jeannie's father had kept her locked in a room from the age of 20 months until the age of 13. Jeannie was harnessed naked to an infant's potty seat and left alone for hours and days throughout the years. When she was remembered at night, she was put to bed in a homemade straitjacket. There were no radios or televisions in the house. People spoke in hushed tones, and the only language Jeannie heard was an occasional obscenity from her father. Jeannie's father hated noise, and if Jeannie made any sound, her father would growl at her like a dog or beat her with a stick. Because of her confinement, Jeannie could not walk, and her eyes could not focus beyond the boundaries of her room. She was malnourished, incontinent, and salivated constantly. When she was finally found and taken into state custody, Jeannie was in bad shape, not only physically and emotionally, but socially as well. When frightened or frustrated, Jeannie would erupt into silent frenzies of rage, flailing about, scratching, spitting, throwing objects, but never uttering a sound. Aside from not speaking, her lack of socialization was also apparent in her behavior. She would urinate in unacceptable places, go up to someone in a store and take whatever she liked of theirs, and peer intently into the faces of strangers at close range. Although social workers tried their best to help Jeannie for several years, she never developed language abilities beyond those of a 4-year-old, and she ended up being placed in an institution for the rest of her life. Socialization is a topic many social psychologists investigate. This is because people are socialized through interactions with other human beings and their cultural products like TV shows, movies, books, magazines, social media. In other words, people are socialized by interacting in some way, shape, or form with the social world. In fact, children seem to be born with the intense need, perhaps we can call it an instinct, to interact with others, which facilitates the socialization process. They do experiments with babies where they have the mother just look at their child and not react with them whatsoever. They don't look at them mean or anything like that, or happy face. They just a stone cold face, and they just look at their child, and the children go nuts. The children try all they can to get the mother to react. The mother doesn't react, and the children start wailing, they start crying really loud. It's almost as if they need that interaction. They want that interaction. And if they don't get it, they react very negatively. There are a lot of outcomes of socialization, a lot of things that people get through the process of socialization. I'm going to focus on 6 of these in this lecture. And the first is practical knowledge. This is one of the most important outcomes of socialization. Learning how to get by and survive in everyday life. We take it for granted, but still, this is a very important knowledge that we learn through the process of socialization that we did not have when we were born. And it's very important, especially for humans, because we're not born with any real instincts, or if we do have instincts, they are very malleable. For example, a snake is born with instincts that tell it to hunt for rodents and other small creatures for food. The mama snake does not have to be around to teach, so to speak, the baby snake what to do. The snake already knows what to do. Conversely, humans aren't born with any knowledge about how to acquire food other than breast milk. They don't even have the knowledge of what can actually be eaten. We take it for granted, our knowledge of how to acquire food and what things are actually considered food. But the fact of the matter is that you learned this stuff, and you learned it through the process of socialization. Evidence that humans learn practical knowledge comes from the fact that what makes up practical knowledge varies tremendously between cultures, societies, and social groups. For instance, in many cultures and societies, animals like ants, grubs, worms, squirrels, possums, horses, dogs, and cats are considered acceptable sources of food. But for the vast majority of Americans, not so much. Also, many cultures do not consider some animals that many Americans eat every day, like cows and pigs, as acceptable food sources. The cultural variability in what different cultures and societies consume as food is not due to differences in genetic heritage between people of different cultures and societies, but rather due to differences in the socialization of what is and what is not considered acceptable food. Another major outcome of socialization is language. Language is a prerequisite for a full participation in a social world. Without language that can represent abstract concepts and ideas, things that are not in our immediate presence, or past experiences, it would be very difficult for people to interact with each other. And interaction among humans is one of the fundamental building blocks of a society. Spoken language is and has historically been especially important, but written language has become ever more important in advanced societies. This is because a lot of society's culture is transmitted through written language, such as textbooks, newspapers, websites. Newborn infants are innately able to acquire any spoken language of the culture in which they belong. Many linguists and psychologists believe that humans have an innate language facility or generative grammar that allows them to learn language. And this makes a lot of sense, especially if you consider baby talk. Many adults speak to babies in ways that would seem difficult to learn how to speak a language. Adults talk to babies in very ungrammatical ways, use a very limited amount of words, and even talk nonsensical gibberish. Now think if you're on your Duolingo app and it's baby talking to you, how fast you would learn the language you're trying to learn. You probably wouldn't learn it at all. Nevertheless, children learn a great deal of vocabulary and grammar despite all these baby talk interactions. Also, children obtain a good sense of proper grammar even before they are formally taught it in school, and despite the ungrammatical nature of a lot of baby talk. We informally learn the rules of grammar, right? Again, anybody who's taken a second language knows how hard that can be once you're an adult. But babies pick it up like that. Language acquisition in the first 3 years of life passes through 4 stages. The pre-speech stage lasts for about the first 10 months and involves speech perception, speech production, and early intentional communication. In the first few weeks of life, infants can perceive all speech sounds, and they begin imitating their parents and producing sounds specific to their parents' language at around 4 to 7 months. With regard to intentional communication, social psychologists find that vocal exchanges involving 4-month-olds and their parents starts to become patterned. Vocalization by either the infant or the caregiver is followed by silence, allowing the other to respond. So the child is starting to learn implicit conversational rules. I talk. When I'm done talking, then you get to talk, and back and forth like that. That's how everyday conversation goes. Again, informal rules learned, not explicitly taught. The second stage, called the first word stage, occurs around 10 to 17 months and involves babies' recognition that objects have names. The first words produced are usually nouns that name or request certain objects. For example, a 1-year-old who's thirsty might say juice or water, right? But that would be about it. The third stage, called the first sentence stage, begins around the 18th month of life. Around this time in the infant's life, there is a vocabulary burst with a doubling in a very short amount of time of the words that they start using correctly. The suddenness of this increase reflects a maturation of cognitive abilities. This in turn is followed by an increase in the complexity of vocalizations, where children start to put together multi-word sentences that are more precise than one-word statements, but often are incorrect grammatically. Examples of this include, please juice mommy, or see kitty daddy. Such speech is sort of text messagey. That is, the number of words is greatly reduced relative to actual speech. And the fourth stage, called the grammar stage, occurs around 24 to 30 months, right? 2 years, 2.5 years. This stage involves the child slowly but surely learning the fundamentals of grammar. Children at this age frequently overgeneralize grammar rules, applying them in contexts where they shouldn't be used. Right? In the English language, for example, children will add the suffix ed that often signifies past tense to words that don't use this suffix to denote past tense, like he throated it over there or he runned away from her. Such usage indicates that the child now understands that there are grammar rules and understands how to apply them. And they learn from correction from their parents and other adults about how to properly apply these rules. The third major outcome of socialization is morals. Morals are the rules that define the right way to behave. People are not born with any sense of right or wrong. Rather, they learn what behaviors are considered right and what behaviors are considered wrong through the process of socialization. This is evidenced by the fact that different cultures and societies and groups socialize members to believe in different sets of morals. For example, in the United States, most people would consider it quite immoral to leave the dead to rot out in the open to be consumed by vultures. But in the religion of Zoroastrianism, which exists still a little bit in Iran and India, this is the moral way to dispose of human remains. You allow the vultures to pick the bones, and once that's done, you go collect the bones and intern them, right? If I were to do that to my dead mother, right, the police would probably be called. Moral socialization proceeds in 6 stages. The first stage of moral development is the obedience and avoiding punishment stage. This is where people obey moral rules in order to avoid punishment. A child is in the obedience and avoiding punishment stage of moral development when he does what his parents tell him to do because he fears getting spanked for being disobedient. The second stage of moral development is the hedonistic stage. This is where people obey moral rules in order to receive rewards. Hedonistic is from the Greek for pleasure. A child is in the hedonistic stage of moral development when he does what her parents tell her to do in order to receive some reward, like a new toy. The third stage of moral development is the good boy, good girl stage. This is where people obey moral rules in order to please others without consideration of rewards and punishments. A person is in the good boy or good girl stage of moral development when he obeys moral rules in order to get others to view him in a positive light. The fourth stage of moral development is the obeying authority stage. This is where people obey moral rules to show respect for authority. A person is in the obeying authority stage when she obeys moral rules because some authority figure, like a parent or priest or teacher or politician, told her that following a particular rule was the right thing to do. The fifth stage of moral development is the social contract stage. This is where people obey moral rules because they view these rules as the will of the majority and because following these rules will prevent them from violating the rights of others. A person is in the social contract stage of moral development when he obeys the law because he sees the law as the will of the people, so to speak. The sixth and final stage of moral development is the universal ethical principles stage. This is where people obey moral rules because these rules are based on some universal ethical principle that can be applied to pretty much all cases and situations, and with absolutely no concern with rewards, punishments, or what other people think, or the general will of the people, because the people could be wrong. A person is in the universal ethical principles stage of moral development when she bases all of her moral decisions and actions on a universal ethical principle, like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have do unto you, and doing so without worrying about whether they're going to be punished for doing so, whether they're going to be rewarded, how it makes them look, whether and what other people say, right? They're just going to apply it, no matter what. Now, no matter what the substance of the morality is, and that can vary quite a bit, people still go through these stages pretty much in order. However, most adults reach only the good boy, good girl stage or obeying authority stages. Relatively few actually reach these two stages that you see here, the social contract stage and the universal ethical principles stage. The fourth major outcome of socialization is values. Values are the objects, ideas, and goals individuals believe are important. There is much cross-cultural and group variation in what individuals value. For example, in some societies, people value artistic endeavors, while in other societies, people couldn't care less. Men in America value toughness and competition, while women in America value personal relationships and cooperation. The cross-cultural and group variation in values is evidence that people are socialized into holding the values of the societies and social groups in which they are raised. The fifth major outcome of socialization is roles. Roles are sets of behavioral expectations based on specific positions that people occupy at a given point in time. Examples of roles include being a parent, a sister, a brother, a child, a teacher, wife, husband, student. Each of these is a position that a person occupies. It can be throughout the person's life or just for a little while. But it carries a set of expectations. Right? For example, in U.S. society, parents are expected to be nurturing and caring toward their children when they occupy the parent role. Right? You have a set of expectations as students. Even though you will only be in this role for a little amount of time, there are a set of expectations that your instructors, myself, expect of you because you are inhabiting this student role. If you were just some random person on the street, I would not expect these things of you. Now, every society has specific roles, and most people in modern society occupy several roles at once. For example, all of you listening to this right now are probably in the role of a student, but you're probably in other roles simultaneously. I'm pretty sure you're in other roles right now, like son, daughter, child, employee, parent, sibling. People both explicitly and implicitly learn roles. People explicitly learn new roles when there is something like formal training in regard to a role. For instance, most employees have to go through an initial training program when they enter that new role of a new employee. People implicitly learn roles by observing the behavior of others who currently occupy that role. For instance, many women learn how to be mothers by modeling their own mother's behavior. Learning new roles occurs throughout a person's life. As people go through the life course, they enter new roles in which they have to be socialized one way or another. This points out an important fact about socialization that often gets lost. Socialization isn't just about children. People go through the socialization process throughout the course of their lives, including in adulthood. A sixth major outcome of socialization is self-concept. The self-concept refers to the thoughts and feelings people have about who they are. Every adult person and every child of a certain age has a self-concept. You all watching this have some conception in your mind about who you are, and you have emotions about that. It could be negative, it could be positive. Nevertheless, you have them. Social psychologists argue that people's self-concepts are made up of identities, and identities are the categories, traits, and roles people use to label themselves and to define who they are. Examples of identities include son, daughter, student, headbanger, nerd, ladies' man, party animal. List goes on and on. There are two major types of identities: personal identities and social identities. Personal identities are the categories, traits, and roles people use to label and define themselves as unique individuals. Often people use adjectives like funny, smart, curious, laid back, and adventurous to describe their personal identities. People use these adjectives to label themselves as unique individuals, and they are often a very important part of one's self-concept. Social identities are the categories, traits, and roles people use to label and define themselves as members of particular social groups. Examples of social identities include Christian, Baptist, Muslim, NIU student, Bears fan, Blackhawks fan, Sox fan, Cubs fan, and so on and so forth. Everybody belongs to a social group. Most people belong to many. So everyone has at least one, if not many, social identities that are an important part of their self-concept. Most psychologists argue that people have the ability to develop self-concepts through the ability of taking the role of the other. Taking the role of the other is a fancy way of viewing oneself from the viewpoint of other people. Being able to see yourself as an object, like taking a third person perspective towards your own self. Learn how to take on the role of others through play and the games that they play with each other as children. Play is the fun imitation of single roles, such as mommy or police officer. During the play phase of growing up, people learn how to take the role of single others. For instance, a little girl is able to put herself in the role of her mother when playing mommy. Games, on the other hand, are fun, organized, and complex activities such as baseball or cops and robbers. Since games require coordination among the participants, people learn how to take the role of several others at once. For example, when you play baseball, you have to be able to anticipate the responses of your teammates. You have to be able to know what they are going to do if a certain play is made, right? You have to know what a shortstop would do, what a pitcher would do, what the left fielder would do. How do you do that? You put yourself in their shoes, right? And by doing that, you are able to also see yourself, start learning how to see yourself through other people's perspective. People develop the capacity to view themselves from the role of the other. They start developing self-concepts. The looking glass theory of self-concept is the idea that people use others as mirrors, so to speak, to form their self-concepts. Looking glass is an old-timey term for a mirror. By taking on the role of the other and viewing themselves through the eyes of others, people develop conceptions about who they are. Now, according to the looking glass theory of the self, people's self-concepts are the result of how individuals think they appear to significant others. This is very important. Significant others are others that are an important part of a person's life. Does a person think that her significant other thinks that she's a dummy? Do they think she's a genius? Do they think she's an upright citizen? Or do they think she's a hoodlum? Do they think she's a wonderful poet? Or do they think she's a numbskull? People's perceptions of what others think of them will influence what type of people they think they are. It's very important to stress that, according to this looking glass theory of self, it is what we think significant others, other people we consider important in our lives, view our behavior that is the most important. How non-significant others view us has little to no influence on our self-conceptions, right? The NPCs of our lives don't really affect how we think of ourselves, right? It's the main characters of our lives. Our girlfriends, our boyfriends, our wives, our husbands, our children, our moms and dads, our best friends. That's who matters. It's also important to stress that, according to the looking glass theory of self, it is how people think significant others see them rather than how significant others actually see them. That's important for the development of self-concept. Because, again, you have to realize we never really truly know what people think. You can't dig into somebody's head and find the actual thoughts. We only know what they can tell us, right? But people often think that people view them in a certain way, when actually they view them in an entirely different way, right? You've probably experienced this yourself. Um, you thought people thought of you in this one way, and then one day a friend just told you the truth, and it shocked you. Right? Why is this? Why is there a discrepancy sometimes between what we think other people think of us and what they actually? Well, there are three main reasons. First, significant others often give dishonest feedback, often to be nice or to avoid arguments and hurt feelings, because you got to remember, these are still people who care about you. People say things to others that are, let's just quite frankly say, are not honest. For example, if your sister is a terrible singer, you may not want to tell her so as not to hurt her feelings. Second, significant others often give inconsistent feedback. A great deal of the feedback that we get from significant others is often inconsistent, often contradictory. One day, a significant other might tell a person that he's awesome at football. Next day, the same significant other might tell the person he's terrible at football. This inconsistent feedback often leads to differences in how people think others view them and how these others actually view them. And as we'll learn when we talk about the self, we often will focus on when people give us positive feedback way more than when they give us negative feedback. So if there's any inconsistency, we always tend to go toward the positive. Third, significant others often give ambiguous feedback. For example, the phrase, "that's nice," can be interpreted in a number of ways, especially in contemporary U.S. society, especially on how you say it, right? It could be, "it's actually nice," right? But if I said it sarcastically, "that's nice," right? It could, I could be saying the opposite in actuality. But sometimes people miss out on those verbal cues and how we say things. And if I was being sarcastic when I said "that's nice," somebody didn't pick up on that, they might think, well, that is nice. That is something good for my self-concept. And it would influence how they think of themselves, even though I don't think of them that way. In actuality, I was being sarcastic. Now I want to change gears a bit and talk about the processes of socialization, which are the means by which people socialize new members into a social group. To put it another way, processes of socialization are the ways in which members of society teach people how to be competent members of a society. And there are three major processes of socialization that we'll talk about here: instrumental conditioning, modeling, and internalization. The first major process of socialization is instrumental conditioning. And this is the process where a person learns what to do in a particular situation through the attaining of rewards and or the avoidance of punishments. A reward is the giving of a pleasant or comforting incentive in order to increase the probability of the behavior in the future. For instance, a reward for good behavior for a child might be taking them out for an ice cream after receiving an A on a spelling test. A reward can be anything positive, right? And it doesn't have to be material either. It could be a smile, it could be a hug, it can be words of praise. It can be material things too, like ice cream, cones, and money. But you have to think very broadly when I use the term reward here. On the other hand, a punishment is the giving of a painful or uncomfortable incentive when a particular behavior occurs in order to decrease the probability of that behavior in the future. Taking away a child's Xbox because she brought home an F on her report card would be an example of a punishment. A punishment is anything negative. And again, you have to think broadly here. You have to think beyond the material here. It can be material, it doesn't have to be. It can be anything negative, from a frown, words of disappointment, spanking, taking away pleasant stimuli, like being grounded, taking away one's iPad. And all of you watching this have experienced instrumental conditioning in your lifetimes. It's one of the ways that you were socialized. When you did things that your adult caregivers wanted you to continue, they probably gave you some sort of reward, right? They gave you, verbal praise, a nice smile, maybe a material reward. Conversely, when you did things your adult caregivers did not want you to continue to do, wanted you to stop, wanted you to not do again, they probably gave you some type of punishment, like taking away your driving privileges, something like that, grounding you. That's all instrumental conditioning. The second major process of socialization is modeling. Modeling is behaving in ways based on observations of others' behavior and its consequences for these others. Now, people don't just model any behavior that they witness. All of you watching this right now have probably seen people do a lot of dumb and crazy things in your life. You probably have not modeled these actions at least most of the time. Maybe sometimes, but most of the time you have not modeled it. So, when do people sort of choose, so to speak, to model other people's behavior? Well, three factors are at work here. First, people are more likely to model behavior when they are in a situation similar to the one in which they learned the behavior. For example, if a child observes his mom give the finger or cursing while driving in the car, the child is more likely to give the finger or curse while he or she is riding in the car with his mom, right? He saw mom do it in that same context. He thinks, well, I should do it too. Parents often get upset at this, but trust me, they learned it from them. Second, people are more likely to model behavior when the model is rewarded for that behavior in some way. This gets back to the idea that people are more likely to behave in ways in which they believe they will receive rewards. Third, people are more likely to model behavior of loving and caring authority figures. That is, children are more likely to imitate the behavior of adults and older kids who are nice, kind, and nurturing to them. That's why children often act like their parents, whether it's good behavior or bad behavior. This is also why if you had a little brother or sister growing up, they copied almost everything they did. It's because they looked up to you. They loved you because you loved them. The third process of socialization is internalization. Internalization is the process by which people come to believe that what others want them to do is what they want to do. Behavior is said to be internalized when a person engages in a behavior without considering for possible rewards and punishments from others. For example, if a person began wanting to get good grades in school, not because she feared punishment from her parents, but simply because she wanted to, then she has internalized the behavior of striving to make good grades. People are more likely to internalize standards of loving caregivers. Thus, most people will internalize the standards of behavior of their caregivers, at least if they are around and they are loving. This is why the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, has some truth to it. Children often do internalize the standards of loving parents, even if these parents hold moral standards and values that most others in a society don't adhere to. For example, no child is born with racist attitudes and values. However, if the child's parents hold racist values and attitudes, and the parents are loving toward the child, then the child is likely to internalize these racist attitudes and values. Internalization is very important for social control, since surveillance of behavior is limited. If everyone acted nice and moral just because they thought others might catch them being mean and immoral and punish them, society would be very harsh indeed. Nevertheless, most people act nice and moral most of the time. I know sometimes it doesn't seem that way, especially if you watch the nightly news, but nevertheless, it's the case. And the reason for this is because most people have internalized moral standards of behavior that keep them from behaving immorally when opportunities arise. Let's discuss the agents of socialization. The agents of socialization are the people and objects that perform the actions of socialization. Socialization just doesn't happen, right? It's not something that just happens with just fairy dust or whatever. Rather, other people and other objects made by people actively socialize individuals in a particular social group, culture, society. There are four major socialization agents in contemporary society, and that's family, peers, educational institutions, and the mass media. The first and often the most important agent of socialization is family. A particular important role the family plays in socialization is the development of attachments. Attachment is defined as a relationship characterized by love, care, and positive feelings. The development of attachments to adult caregivers is very important for early development. Attachments develop not just from meeting basic biological needs like providing food and water, but also with expressing warmth, love, care, such as holding a child for long periods of time, hugging and kissing the child, stroking the child's back when she's in distress. Social psychologists have found that children who do not form attachments with adult caregivers end up suffering from major cognitive impairment and poor health. For example, in 1946, a social psychologist studied an orphanage in which 6 nurses cared for 45 infants under 18 months old. The nurses met the children's basic biological needs, but had little contact with them otherwise. How could they? There were 45 of them and only 6 of them. Thus, the children did not develop attachments to any adult caregivers because of the lack of affection. The researchers found that within 2 years of visiting this orphanage, 1/3 of the children had died, 9 had been adopted or transferred to another orphanage. Those were the lucky ones. And the 21 who remained in the institution became severely mentally retarded. Another way parents affect children is through their parenting styles. The social psychologist Diana Baumrind developed a typology of parenting based on 2 things. The first is the warmth exhibited by the parents toward the children, how much love and care they express and show. And 2, how much control they exert on their children. You know, Do they just let them do whatever the hell they want, or do they, have boundaries? Limited screen times, you know, strict bedtimes, things like that. Parents who express high warmth and exert high control of their children are called authoritative parents. These types of parents set clear boundaries for their children, usually reason with their children when they punish them, and show them lots of affection. Parents who express little warmth and exert high control are called authoritarian parents. These parents set clear boundaries, usually give children direct orders, do it because I said so, but they show little affection towards their children. Parents who express a lot of warmth but little control are called permissive parents. These parents love their children, but they let them get away with everything, so to speak. Finally, parents who show little warmth and exert little control are called aloof parents. These types of parents don't really seem to care about their children one way or the other. They let them do whatever they want, but they don't really show them any love. Social psychologists have found that the authoritative style of parenting, with high warmth and high control, leads to the best outcomes for children. Children raised in authoritative styles have higher self-esteem, they tend to perform better in school, they commit crime as adolescents and adults, and have better relationships with their peers than children raised in the other three ways. Social psychologists have also shown that there are differences in how middle-class parents and working class and poor parents raise their children. And these differences have important sociological consequences. Social psychologists argue that middle-class parents raise their children in a way they call concerted cultivation. This involves enrolling children in many organized activities and the constant development of language and reasoning skills. Right. It could be, the organized activities can be things like team soccer, weekly music lessons, weekly dance lessons, going to Taekwondo on a weekly basis. And the development of language and reasoning skills are like playing word games in a car ride, or something like that. On the other hand, working class and poor parents tend to raise their children in a way social psychologists call natural growth. This involves letting children play on their own, not involving them in too many organized activities, and the use of directives instead of reasoning and discipline. According to social psychologists, the differences in child rearing between middle class and working class and poor parents leads to different ways of approaching the world for children. Through concerted cultivation, middle-class kids develop a sense of entitlement, or a general belief that institutional authorities are to cater to their needs and wants. These are children that know that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and feel that institutional authorities, especially teachers, are to cater to their needs and demands. For example, children with a sense of entitlement demand that their teachers help them with their homework, and actually will tell teachers that they shouldn't give them so much homework. Through natural growth, however, working class and poor kids develop a sense of constraint, or a belief that they have to take what they get from institutional authorities and to be submissive and or distrustful of these authorities. This sense of constraint prevents them from navigating and exploiting institutions in order to get ahead. They keep quiet in class, don't demand too much from their teachers, often feel very shy and very hesitant to ask for help. The differences in parenting styles between parents of different social classes isn't just interesting just in and of itself, Rather, it's interesting because a lot of social psychologists argue that the differences in parenting between classes actually helps to explain, at least somewhat, the phenomenon of the intergenerational transmission of class. The intergenerational transmission of class is the robust finding that in American society, a child is more likely to remain in the class in which they are born. It's not a deterministic relationship, but if you had to bet money, you would want to bet that a child born middle class will be middle class as an adult. A child born poor would be poor as an adult. You'd win more money than you'd lose, basically. And why is that? Well, again, a lot of social psychologists say it has to do with these parenting styles. It's through the development of senses of entitlement and constraint in particular. A sense of entitlement helps middle class children stay middle class adults because they believe they are entitled to certain privileges from institutional authorities. For example, kids that demand help from their teachers in school are more likely to get higher grades because one-on-one instruction always leads to better understanding of the material. Better grades leads to getting into college and leads to getting into very good colleges. That in turn leads to obtaining a well-paying career, and thus the person remains middle class. A sense of constraint, on the other hand, helps working class and poor children stay working class or poor because they don't believe they are entitled to certain privileges from institutional authorities. For example, due to their senses of constraint, working class kids often don't ask for help from their teachers in school. They just do it on their own, or they just get it wrong, right? And because of this, their grades are likely to be low, which prevents them from getting into colleges and prevents them from getting into good colleges, gets them tracked into vocational programs in high school. All of this almost assures that these children who grow up working class end up working class as an adult. Again, not a deterministic relationship, but a probabilistic relationship. If you had to bet money, you'd bet that a kid born in this class is going to end up in the same class as an adult. The second major agent of socialization is peers, or one's friends and colleagues. Social psychologists have found that peers influence the short-term interests of children, like what music they listen to, what clothes they wear, but parents still have a greater sway over long-term goals, such as choice of college or choice of occupation, right? So peers mostly influence kids' styles, basically, what music they listen to, what clothes they wear. Many of you listening to this probably don't listen to exactly the same music your parents listen to, maybe a little bit, but not totally, right? And I'm guessing you probably don't dress like your parents do, at least when you're going out to the club or whatever. The third major agent of socialization in contemporary society is educational institutions, such as elementary schools, high schools, religious education programs like Sunday schools, and universities. Social psychologists argue that educational institutions socialize people by teaching both a formal and informal curriculum. The formal curriculum is the explicit things educational institutions teach children. In elementary schools, for example, the formal curriculum includes such things as learning to read and write and perform basic mathematical tasks. The formal curriculum consists of the avowed goals of the educational institutions. If you ask people who work at these educational institutions, what are your goals? They will list off the formal curriculum. The informal curriculum, on the other hand, is the hidden, subtle things educational institutions teach children. The informal curriculum is not part of the avowed goals of the educational institutions. In fact, most people who work in these educational institutions don't even realize that they are teaching the informal curriculum and often will deny that they're doing so. Nevertheless, they're still doing it. For example, spelling bees and school sports teach children the value and importance of competition, which some social psychologists argue socialize children into sort of capitalist ways of thinking, because capitalism is in a large part about competition. Businesses compete with one another, employees compete with one another for valued raises and promotions. Also, grades on report cards and honor rolls socialize children into the belief that the U.S. is a meritocracy, or a society that always rewards those who have talent and work hard. While that would be very nice, again, if you take a sociology intro class, you'll find out that's not the case. The last major agent of socialization in contemporary society is the mass media. The mass media is information and entertainment products that are meant to be consumed by a large audience. Examples of mass media include television, print media like books and magazines, and the internet and all that it provides, including streaming services. The mass media is a relatively new agent of socialization, at least compared to the previous three. And some forms of media, such as television and the internet, are especially new. However, the effect of the mass media on socialization continues to grow, especially with the explosive growth in the amount of mass media available in people in contemporary societies. Many of you listening to this will take it for granted now, but you have the ability to constantly consume mass media wherever you go. It has never been easier to do so, right? You can, watch the Real Housewives of Atlanta sitting around on a couch with some friends. You can listen to Melanie Martinez while running on the treadmill. You can read the Washington Post or BuzzFeed on your smartphone while sitting on the toilet, right? And so this has become more and more of an important agent of socialization in recent years. Have an enormous impact on gender socialization, which is the teaching and learning of norms, beliefs, and values regarding male and female behavior in a particular social group. How men and women, boys and girls act is not biologically given, but is mostly the product of socialization. One piece of evidence for this is the enormous variation in gender norms between social groups. If the differences between men and women were biologically given, we wouldn't see such variation in gender norms between social groups. But this is what we see. For instance, the Arapesh of New Guinea believe that women should be the one to carry heavy loads because they believe women are stronger than men. In Doheny, West Africa, women formed the king's bodyguards because they were seen as fierce warriors. The Munugamari, a tribe of headhunters and cannibals in New Guinea, women are expected to be as fierce and as belligerent as men. Women hate giving birth and nursing because it keeps them from participating in warfare. Also, in many cultures, men wear makeup and get all gussied up for the women, not vice versa. For example, the Wadabe, a society of pastoral nomads who live in Niger, it is the men, the culture who dress up, who put on makeup, and it is the men who participate in beauty contests to win the hearts of the ladies, not the other way around. Furthermore, there is a mountain of social psychological research that reveals that the variations between men and women is much less than the differences within each sex. So in other words, there are more differences between individual men than there are between the average man and the average woman. The largest differences between men and women are in motor performance, especially after puberty, physical aggression, and masturbation. Despite there being little biological basis for gender differences, we nevertheless see it in our everyday lives. Men and women wear different clothes, play different sports, watch different TV shows, act in different ways. Where does this come from? Well, social psychologists argue that a lot of this is because of the socialization process and is the result of the actions of the agents of socialization. Family is a very important agent of gender socialization. In the U.S., traditional gender norms, beliefs, and values are often passed down from parents to children. Right? Adult caregivers impose gender norms on children from birth. For example, in the U.S., baby boys are dressed in blue and baby girls are usually dressed in pink. Of course, there is nothing inherent in the colors blue and pink that suggests gender differences, and a child is not going to be harmed or injured if you dress him or her in a color associated with another gender, right? You put a baby boy in pink, it's not going to explode or die. In fact, in the beginning of the 20th century, it used to be the opposite. Baby girls were the ones dressed in blue because blue was associated with the Virgin Mary. And boys were dressed in pink because pink was associated with blood, because pink is just a shade of red, and blood was associated with vitality and vigor. Adult caregivers contributed to gender socialization in several ways. First, by just direct teachings about gender. When they say, well, that's, boys don't do that, little girls don't act that way, things like that. Little girls don't shout, boys don't cry. These direct teachings about gender are one of the ways adult caregivers contribute to gender socialization. Adult caregivers also serve as models for children to learn from and to imitate in regard to how men and women should behave. Children often look at their parents to see differences in how they act, and they model these behaviors accordingly. Also, adult caregivers contribute to gender socialization by rewarding and punishing gendered behaviors. Right? An example of rewarding is when a little girl is rewarded with smiles and hugs for looking cute in a pretty frilly dress. And an example of punishing is when a dad yells at his little boy for playing with a Barbie doll. Are also an important agent of gender socialization. Peers contribute to gender socialization mainly by enforcing gender-appropriate behavior. Peers enforce appropriate gender norms of dress and activities through mocking, shunning, and assaulting those who dress or act in gender inappropriate ways. For example, consider this observation between three boys in a preschool observed by a social psychologist. Boy one says, "Fix me," pointing to an unfastened zipper in the dress. They're playing dress up. Boy two says, "You're not a girl." Boy three, "You're a boy." Boy two says, "Those are girl things." And then he observes boy one hurriedly slip out of the dress. So that mocking. He wanted to play dress up. Boy one felt comfortable wearing a dress, but he was told he was not a girl. His peers told him he was a boy, that he's not allowed to wear that, and he took it off. And that, enforcing gender norms. Educational institutions are another important agent of gender socialization. Educational institutions contribute to gender socialization by teaching gender norms through their hidden curriculum. For example, vocational schools often have courses that highlight and support gender differences. You have cosmetology versus masonry. You have nursing versus carpentry. There was a vocational school where I grew up, and they had masonry. I don't think they had one uh, girl in that class my entire time there, and they had cosmetology. I don't think they had one fella. Also, teachers often encourage and enforce gender appropriate behavior, as your reading for this topic showed. The research that you read found that preschool teachers enforce gender norms in two main ways. First, preschool teachers allow boys to be more relaxed and make girls act more formally in the class. Teachers are more likely to reprimand girls for their posture and sitting, telling them that they had to sit like quote unquote nice young ladies. But however, boys were allowed to sit in relaxed positions, such as with their arms holding them up while they laid back. They didn't have to sit up. According to this researcher, these activities on the part of teachers leads to differences in how men and women carry themselves, with men feeling freer about their bodies and more relaxed in social settings, and women feeling inhibited about their bodies and bodily tensed in social situations. This probably explains the phenomenon of man spreading, right? That men in public, spots, especially like in public transportation, like on the L or the Metro, seem to take up a lot of space. And if this research has any validity, it's that they've been socialized to assume that they can do this. Also, preschool teachers make girls be quieter than boys while in the classroom. Girls are often told to be quieter or to say something quieter and quote unquote nicer about 3 times as often as boys are. This is despite the fact that boys are actually noisier than girls. And this teaches boys that they have the right to talk anytime they wish, thus implying that they have power, right? While it teaches girls that their proper place is to be quiet and submissive, thus implying that they have no power. Agents of socialization influence gender socialization by discussing how the mass media contributes to this. Social scientists who study portrayals of gender in the mass media focus on two things. The first is recognition, which simply refers to the quantity of representation of gender groups. In other words, recognition focuses on how often characters and people presented in the mass media are girls and women or boys and men. Overall, boys or men are represented more in the mass media than girls or women. For example, one study found that boys or men make up about 60% of characters in television programming. Also, in G-rated movies, male characters outnumber female characters 2.6 to 1. That is, for almost every female character in a Disney or Pixar movie, there are almost 3 male characters. So in terms of recognition in the mass media, boys and men get more recognition than girls and women. And although this seems biased, and it's not as biased as it used to be. Representation actually has and seems to be continuing to get better in the mass media. The other thing social scientists who study portrayals of gender in the mass media focus on is respect, which is whether persons of each gender are presented in complex and non-stereotypical one-dimensional ways. Unfortunately, the mass media in the U.S. and other English-speaking countries tends to portray boys and men and girls and women in stereotypical ways. Mass media often portrays girls and women in very stereotypical ways. For example, girls and women in television shows, films, and commercials tend to be portrayed as very, perhaps even overly, concerned about their physical appearance. Also, female characters in mass media tend to be judged by their physical appearance, with other characters making many more comments about female characters' physical appearances than male characters' physical appearances. For example, in a study of programs on the Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, and Cartoon Network, female characters were found to be more attractive, more concerned about their appearance, and more likely to receive comments about their looks than the male characters. The mass media often portrays boys and men also in very stereotypical ways. For example, male characters tend to be portrayed as physically aggressive, quite bossy, fearless, physically strong, hypermuscular, with super big arms, six-pack abs, and quite unromantic. Also, female and male characters tend to be portrayed as having jobs stereotypically associated with their gender. For example, in movies, the ratio of men to women characters having jobs in a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, is around 8 to 1. That is, for every female character in movies that is portrayed as having a STEM job, there are 8 male characters portrayed as having a STEM job. Also, in commercials for products that can help with daily house chores, like childcare and cooking, men are depicted as much less successful at house chores than women. In other words, it shows these hapless husbands and dads not knowing how to turn on a dishwasher or scrub a floor. And as you can probably tell me from your own experiences, children and adolescents consume a lot of mass media. Kids and teenagers watch a lot of YouTube, Netflix, Cartoon Network, Disney Plus. So mass media, especially in today's day and age, is a major agent of socialization for gender norms and stereotypes. We know this because social scientists consistently find relationships between how much mass media kids and teenagers consume and how much they accept and thus follow traditional gender norms and stereotypes. For example, in one experiment, teenagers exposed to stereotypical clips from television comedies and dramas reported more traditional gender role attitudes than those exposed to non-stereotypical content. In another experiment, teenagers who were asked to watch stereotypical music videos endorsed more traditional gender roles than teenagers who didn't watch these music videos. Saying to yourself, so what? Ages of socialization tend to teach boys and girls to act and think in traditional ways. They teach that boys should act like boys and girls should act like girls, so to speak. What does it matter? Well, it matters because traditional gender socialization leads to negative consequences for both women and men. For women, the endorsement of traditional femininity is associated with greater symptoms of depression and anxiety and lower self-esteem. This is probably because society as a whole tends to value masculine traits over feminine traits, and self-esteem, as you'll learn later, is largely the result of other people's judgments. The endorsement of traditional femininity is also associated with the development of eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia, especially in white women, and the greater use of potentially dangerous beauty products and procedures like very strong chemical pills and Brazilian butt lifts. Every now and then you hear on the news about some women becoming very ill and perhaps dying because they were having unregulated beauty procedures done on them by people without medical licenses. Similarly, the endorsement of traditional masculinity is associated with greater symptoms of depression and drug use, most likely because many men aren't or don't feel capable of living up to traditional masculine standards, and because traditional masculine standards often prevent men from seeking out mental health care. Also, the endorsement of traditional masculinity is associated with high levels of risk-taking, since men are supposed to be brave and fearless, of course. This risk-taking can take many forms, from a higher likelihood of having unprotected sex, to not wearing seat belts, to smoking tobacco and vaping. And all this behavior, I hopefully don't have to tell you, can lead to many negative consequences. So that's why social psychologists say you should care about traditional gender socialization. It has negative consequences for women and for men. So that's it for the socialization lecture. See you next time.